Hello, this is Tracy from Convertro. Just wanted to take a minute really quick and just talk a bit about display. I think it's probably one of the channels that are surrounded by the most vague ambiguity possible. It's pretty easy to find interesting insights in display, but trying to figure out how to actually make it actionable and move forward and make recommendations on it can sometimes be a little bit more challenging. So we're just going to try to crack the nugget on that. I'll be as brief as possible through this. What is display? Display typically can just be some kind of a picture. It can be a text, a graphic image, or just even a flat out logo. It's just something that's illustrated somewhere on a client's web page. For the most part, display can be very versatile for different types of clients who are heavy into either branding or even actually DR. However, if you're going to be using display branding for DR, it's very critical that you have a very compelling offer in the creative. Otherwise, it's just going to fall very flat. But back to my points here. Depending on the product and the service that the actual display ad is evaluating, it can be either something that's flash, it can be something that's dynamic, like the movie trailers or different pop-ups that come up, or it can even be just very simple and static. There are a few different things that are nomenclatures to the display world. RTB means real-time bidding, and DSPs means a demand-side platform. Both of those things refer to an auction that occurs every single time a display ad is called forward. So essentially what happens is a user will go to a publisher's website. That website will start loading. As it's loading, simultaneously the publisher will send out a bid request that will actually be describing the different attributes of the user. What is an attribute? An attribute can be anything from, hey, I've got a 30-year-old male, he's Indian, he lives in New York right now, and he was just on a website looking for airfare from Delhi High. So that information then gets sent out, and all of the different auctions that are happening at the same time will actually evaluate the placement for this particular call. So the highest bidder in this particular case would get that particular placement, and their ad would then show up on whatever that publisher's website happens to be. So the neat thing about actually all of this is that the entire process happens in between 300 and 500 milliseconds. There is no delay to the user. It happens so rapidly fast, and for the most part, the user doesn't even realize this is happening. This is actually something that happens for every single ad slot out there. So it's pretty impressive, actually. So just a couple of logos of some of the larger DSPs in the area that we work with frequently. A couple of other things at Convertro that we track. Advertisers are extremely interested in view-through. View-through can be broken down into a couple of different things. It can apply to email. For the most part, though, it will be applying to display. There's two different types of display ads that can be projected out there. One is a retargeting ad, and the second one is a prospecting ad. What's the difference between the two? Retargeting is when a user will actually go to the client's website and they'll bounce off. However, on the client's website page, there's going to be a different set of vendor benchmarks. For instance, if somebody comes to the home page and they bounce off, that's not very interesting to the user, and it's not very interesting to the client. So the client's not really going to necessarily care that much about retargeting that particular user. However, if that user travels into an inner page somewhere and is visiting a travel to Italy page and they're viewing the photo gallery of all these different expensive hotels, then a vendor and the client might identify that particular user as having a higher intent. So that particular page, the expensive hotel Italy page, will actually drop a cookie that will attach itself to the user's browser. So this particular cookie will store information such as, hey, this particular user just looked at expensive Italy hotels, go ahead and retarget him. From there, the vendor will be tracking that particular cookie. They'll be tracking that particular user throughout their web, their surfing. So what will happen is if that user decides to go to New York Times or they happen to go to foxnews.com and there's an ad placement opportunity right there, the vendor can very easily just slide in that particular image of a hotel in Italy that was super expensive that the user was just looking at. Constantly repeating this cycle for users and elevating their brand exposure does tend to lead to a higher intent and a higher chance of conversion. Whereas prospecting, the other type of display, is essentially you're just blasting the entire market with a brand new website or a brand new client that they've never seen before. It's essentially putting a display ad in front of a user that's never been to the site before. So there are a couple of different things about this that are very interesting. There are going to be the different display impressions that users just don't actually click on, and then there are going to be the other ones that users will click on and they'll follow through and go to the site, and then that's a totally different story. We're also extremely interested in users that don't end up clicking, as much so as we are in users that do end up clicking. We get a lot of testing and a lot of learnings information from users that do not click, that we like to harbor that data, regurgitate that data, funnel that data, and then make stronger, more precise strategic recommendations. So how do we do that? Specifically, we use a view pixel, which will track all of the different impressions, even though that user didn't click onto the website. So what will happen is through the media pixel, we are actually able to see that media pixel, that the image loaded, and what kind of device it was loaded on. Was it a laptop, or was it an iPhone? Was it a tablet? Was it a desktop? We'll be able to capture all of that information, which we will then associate on our back end with our SID, which is our unique identifier that we give to each individual user. And it will actually map that particular device, that tablet, that iPhone, or whatever have you, to a particular user's funnel, or what we would call their click trail, or their media cycle, so to say. So our pixel, it's very light. It will just run right alongside each creative. It's in a 1-to-1 pixel format. So every single time that creative uploads to a website or to the user's computer, what will happen is our pixel will fire off, and every time that pixel fires off, it just takes a mere quick caption of everything that it can see, which is going to be the user's device and etc., things like that. It will then take all of that information, it will trigger a response and send that response back to our systems, which will say, hey, there was an impression that was loaded here, however, it didn't get clicked on, and because there's no click-through, it now just becomes a viewable impression. So then we're able to evaluate brand equity, display impact, creative awareness, etc., just based on that really quick snapshot that we get from the pixel. So display optimizing is actually a very fun thing to do. I personally love this particular medium. There's usually a lot of data to deal with and many different avenues you can look at. It's going to be a while before you run dry on ideas. You're going to be looking at creatives, you're looking at placements, you're looking at ad size, you're looking at promotions. You're going to evaluate static ads differently than you'll be evaluating dynamic ads, different than flash ads. It's a very interactive medium, and it can be a ton of fun. So how does ConvertRow help? There are a lot of overlaps between the different ad networks. They will all actually share the same type of inventory. If you're being very specific, say for instance you only want men that are 30 years old, that are Indian, that live in New York, you're going to be dealing with a very small subset of pool, which all of the different vendors do have their fingers able to get into that pool. Unfortunately, you will be sharing the same inventory amongst different vendors. So it is extremely possible for one user to see the same exact display ad sometimes upwards of 1,000 times. Not only will it be oversaturating that user, but also not all 1,000 of these different display ads are necessarily from the same vendor. If you're running with 10 different vendors, maybe they're only getting blasted 100 times per vendor. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that there's definitely going to be some strong overlap, and that's something that we evaluate on, and that's something that we try to skim out as much as possible. So since you do have multiple vendors targeting one particular user, they're most likely not aware of the inventory that other vendors are using. So this is an area where you enable your client to have open communication back with the vendors. So clearly, whenever you're targeting a user this many times through this many different vendors, it is a very, very, very large waste of their spend. And it can even at times decrease the likelihood of a user converting. It can be very dangerous. So what we do to help, and specifically in this particular case, is we will identify each impression. We can track it back to the same user. We can identify for the client which vendor actually reached that particular user first in the funnel, and how many impressions is optimal for a client to saturate a user with prior to a conversion. So we had one e-commerce client, and they go into market really, really heavily over Mother's Day. And what they did not at this particular time have any type of frequency capping enabled for any of their vendors. So individual vendors were sending upwards of 4,400 impressions per vendor to one particular user. That's not nearly even taking into consideration all the different overlap. And if you've got 10 vendors that are blasting one user 4,400 times, that can be quite obnoxious and quite overwhelming for a particular user. So the problem where this was with this particular client is they were also paying out on a CPM, or a cost per thousand. Every 1,000 impressions that fired off is what their cost modeling was towards that particular vendor. So then we went back and we created and built out a custom report for this client, evaluating user intent to purchase based on number of impressions that were seen. And what we found, surprisingly actually, is that 85% of the traffic converted after the 17th impression, and then only 15% of the traffic ended up converting anywhere from the 18th impression to the 4,400th impression. Clearly, there's a tremendous amount of waste. If you have just as high of a likelihood of converting, a higher likelihood of converting after 17 impressions than you do after 4,400, you will definitely want to start capping your display views in a more moderate type of a way. We then went back to the client. We recommended that they install some frequency capping. We recommended the number 17 to them, and they capped it immediately and ended up saving them $1 million in 1 month right off the bat. So they were very pleased by that. So typically when I work with different clients and I'm going through the different display initiatives and what their goals are for the team or the department, there are a few things that constantly keep coming up. ROI is one thing that is always coming up. It's not necessarily siloed to the display channel. It seems to just be the overall media perspective and the goal and the focus of the path that all the CMOs want to walk down. But everybody is also very interested in reducing waste. Beyond that, they want to take that money that they've just saved and they want to immediately reallocate the spend in such a way that it will scale up their business. There's a couple of reasons for this. For the most part, most department heads, most directors, they're actually incentivized by their company just on a base of a performance. They don't care necessarily that much about growth because their bonuses are just tied to flat performance. In some situations, as you get higher and higher up the company, a CMO is going to have a lot more incentive to actually grow the company just based on whatever their exit clause is in their contract. But however, when you start dealing with department heads, they aren't necessarily as interested in trying to save money because if they don't spend their budget, they will lose their budget and they will never have their budget again. So we like to break this down as easily for clients as possible to make it a win-win for both at the CMO level and also at the department head level. So we like to reward sources that perform very strongly as a first touch point, and we can very successfully and very quantitatively make that case for each of our different clients. After that, we like to take a look at users that land on the site. As far as that, there's more of a compelling nature for a particular user to convert after they've been to the client's website. So if you ever get pushback from a client that says, hey, I don't understand why I need to optimize towards the first touch point, well, optimally what happens is once a user engages with your website, based on the content and the engagement levels of that particular website, we hope that your website is good enough to actually re-engage that user again and actually provide more information that then draws them in even further into the conversion funnel of actually accepting and buying into the brand. So that is one reason why we actually reward first touch points is more because we see them as way more critical in the entire sales funnel piece than we do a particular media channel that comes in right before the end or right before the close, so to say. So we do use a lot of different types of tracking at the company, and so we can walk a client through multiple different reports that will help them determine how to best optimize this particular channel or any channel or figure out what the behavior is amongst all the cross channels. But often what we see in display, like I said before, is just a lot of overlapping. There's a ton of saturation, and like I said before, if a user is just as likely to convert after 17 impressions as they are after 4,400 impressions, then it is our onus to actually want to dig into the optimizations that mitigate the vendors who do not perform strongly and make these recommendations for our clients. So the way we identify vendors that don't perform very strongly is, again, just going back to what we just said a minute ago about the funnel, just evaluating which vendors come at the top of the funnel and which ones will actually work more as a closer. We're going to want to not necessarily get rid of, but we're not going to want to reward as highly sources that perform as a strong closer. So from there, we can evaluate by integrating the spend into the dashboard, and we can start running a lot of very precise ROI type of reporting, which will give them at the creative level exact metrics on what they have seen, what they can expect, and futuristically what they can project. So it's a very interesting tool that can go pretty deep pretty quickly. So hope I haven't bored you too much. Ask if you have any questions. I'm Tracy at convertro.com.